glad to see so many of you, and I think there's a simple reason why so many people are attracted by it, and this is this beautiful thing here. We all have it, and we are all fascinated by it, and it's just incredible how much neuroscience has advanced over the past 100 years. And I've had the chance to do a PhD in Computational Neuroscience at EPFL a few years ago with Wolfram Gerstner, and we have studied learning in the brain from a theoretical point of view with some experiments, behavioral experiments, and some modeling, in particular in reinforcement learning. But actually, my goal today is to share some of the fascination I have for the brain, the human brain, and do a few links with machine learning, artificial intelligence, and all the other hot topics. And I guess that's the other reason why there are many people. I guess many people are interested in learning about brain, about machine learning, artificial intelligence. So I'm in the lucky position to be able to talk a bit about these buzzwords, but they are more than buzzwords. They are actually they're substantial, and I hope you enjoy the talk and get out a little bit of the messages where the two fields meet and how I personally think. So this is a quite opinionated talk. On the one hand, I share facts with you. I show you a few main results from neuroscience research over the past that have come across the past 120 years or so. And apart from these facts side, I have kind of a personal perspective on how we should think about brain and artificial intelligence. Okay, so first, one slide about the place I'm working at. This is Ost. We are in Buchs, Rapperswil, St. Gallen. And we do a number of study programs at bachelor, mostly at bachelor level. So architecture, civil engineering, spatial planning, health, information technology, social work, electrical engineering, renewable energies and environmental engineering, mechanical engineering and innovation, systems engineering, business administration, etc. So that was the little teaser for our Ost. And one little reason also why I'm here is maybe this one. I know some students think, okay, I want to do computer science. What am I doing here? That's a perfectly fine question to ask. I mean, personally, I'm saying it's worth going through theory. There's a clear statement about this. But it's not everybody's thing. And contact me. If you think you're more the applied guy, contact me. Don't. But now back to the actual topic here. And I talk about brain research, I talk about AI, ML, and now I have put a question mark there. I talk about how the two are linked and how does the one help to understand the other, question mark. I have these two fields, neuroscience and machine learning, and just as a mental model for this talk, I add a little thing here. When I talk about neuroscience, I consider it more like a research area, and when I talk about machine learning, I more consider it as an engineering area. I know there is many researchers as well doing that at the theoretical level, but there is also a lot of engineering going on, and a lot of people try to apply these methods to solve whatever task has to be solved. So when I talk about machine learning, I have this engineering perspective of solving problems and applying things. While in neuroscience, I touch a little bit more fundamental results from the past years. Interestingly, the two fields, since the beginning, they are tightly linked to each other. We've had a picture of a neuron like 120 years ago, and this has inspired mathematical models and has finally led to the development of abstract models of neurons, which are nowadays used in artificial neural networks. So the question then is how, and of course it also goes the other way around. We apply deep learning to understand signals in the brain, and I don't know if other talks are covering this. There's one about natural language processing. I don't know whether he's going to talk about that, but we apply deep learning to understand signals in the brain. Okay, if I do this, two arrows, these links, there is an assumption, namely, why should this help us? Why should an engineering perspective help us? And the assumption is, well, we think it's a kind of a belief that we can get a mechanistic understanding of the brain. This has not always been the case. Some people thought the brain is something beyond the physical world, or at least consciousness and those topics are beyond the physical world. We think, and that's just an assumption in the end, we think we can get a mechanistic understanding of the brain. And keep this word mechanistic in mind for the next picture then. Just one word, there's a limitation. The way we think about the brain also is always limited by the current paradigm, and this is illustrated by this one here. If we think about complex machines in the 17th century, that's somehow what people were able to do back then. That was probably one of the most complex machines in that time, and complex machines have always shaped the paradigm about what is the brain doing. And if we look at this picture here, that's a drawing by René Descartes in the 1620s, and he applied, well, geometry, math, physics to understand brain, and he called it the animal machine. So in another context, animals were basically mechanical machine, complex. At his time, he did not dare yet to call the human being a machine. He didn't go that far, and there is a little thing in the brain which is beyond the mechanistic understanding. At least that's his drawing. What he really thought about, we don't know. Now, 100 years later, 120, there was de la Métrie in 1747, and he called it then l'homme machine, and said, the human body is a machine that winds up its own springs. It is a living image of the perpetual motion. And I think in this text, this pretty much resonates this picture. Complex machine, brain, we just need enough springs and gears, and we can build not only a brain, but actually a human being. So that's a quite radical position for someone living in the Enlightenment period. We jump 100 years or so, no, not quite. Industrial Revolution, what was the most complex thing or most impressive thing then? It was a factory, of course. And when I was in primary school, like 30 years ago, no, even more, I had this picture at the wall in my classroom. It's by VIScon, Der Mensch als Industriepalast, Man as Industrial Palace. And chemistry was en vogue. They had huge plants, well, chemical plants, etc., and factories. So he pictured human beings not only as a complex machine, but as a factory. And as a brain researcher, we focus now a little bit here. And he didn't have a very clear understanding of what the brain is or should be or works, but it seems, at least we know it's all men. Thinking is, there's no women. There might be a few women here in the call center maybe, but that's how in the 1920s people pictured it. And maybe we are a little bit laughing about that, but it was an impressive paradigm. Things are factories, we have supply chains, etc. And this paradigm was applied. And nowadays, what is our revolution we are living in? It's a digital revolution. And what is the most complex machine we have? It's a computer. And if people talk about the brain, you sometimes see like a cartoonish version of this one. There's some input, there's some output, and we have this brain-like device, and computer science and brain science merge seamlessly into something beyond whatever. But this is strongly biased, I think. Our thinking, as useful as it is to have abstractions and paradigms, it's also a little bit of a danger. And there's one little thing or one little message I would like to pass. No, the first one is it's a cool topic. The second one is we should be careful about the paradigms we have in mind. That's just a little warning. I don't have a concrete answer of how to deal with, but let's say it's a warning. Now, first, if we study brain, the question to ask is maybe, why do we have a brain? What do you think? Why this machine up here? Why did evolution put so much effort in this machine? Why does our body put so much energy and complexity into the brain? There's a reason for it. I'll let you think for a few seconds, and it might help to go back a few million years, actually 500 million years, Can you see? It's a jellyfish. Like 500 million years ago, evolution that's kind of the first appearance of neurons in evolution. And these jellyfish, they can sense their environment. They have chemical sensors, they have light sensors, they have interneurons, and they can contract their muscles or whatever kind of muscle they have. And basically, they have all type of neurons able to do simple movements. They have new interneurons to connect different informations and behave accordingly. So they can swim towards the source of light or whatever. Now, if we jump let's say 400 million years, so to about 50 million years ago, evolution has brought us this one. It's mammals, a cat, mice. And this picture is very different from the other one. Here, what the cat is doing cannot be explained by an immediate input-output relationship. The cat does not even see the mouse or the mice. There's something going on that's beyond at least a very direct and simple input-output mapping. It has to have learned something, it has to memorize something. Maybe the cat has learned to listen, and first, okay, there is some hints of food coming or whatever. So there's a brain at work, definitely. And that's a much more complex thing than just moving towards a light source or a chemical source. So question was, why do we have a brain? And in the words of Daniel Wolpert, a renowned neuroscientist, he said, one single reason to have a brain is to produce adaptable and complex movements. Moving is the only way to affect the world around you. And I think I pretty much share this statement. Movement need to be controlled. They are extremely precise and complex, and we learn to move. If you learn an instrument, you know how difficult it is to learn precise movement, but we are able to do it. And the brain is there to help us adapting and developing complex movements. And there is a counterexample I took from Yael Nif, I think she came up with this example. It's about this animal here. So it's not the slug, but the German word is Wasserscheide, I think. I don't know exactly what kind of animal it is. It has two phases of life. In the first phase, it swims through the ocean. It has a small brain. And then at some point in life, it finds a place and stays there. It just opens the mouth and water flows in and it digests whatever comes in. But there's no more movement. And one of the first things this animal here does is it digests its own brain. There's no more use for the brain. It just sits there and eats. Now let me show a few numbers about the human brain. The thing we talk about is has a volume of roughly 1 liter, a bit more than a kilogram. It has in the order of 100 billion neurons. So 10 to the 9, 11. There's discussions about these numbers, but that's roughly the order. We have the number of synapses, difficult to estimate, but it's huge numbers, let's say. And the interesting fact about these contrast these huge numbers with a very small energy consumption of only 20 watts. We do all this with the energy of a light bulb. And that's one of the reasons why it's worth studying this supercomputer here and understand its architecture. If we can replicate this to a certain extent, or at least understand fundamental computing principles, it would be the next computational revolution. So how do we study the brain? Let me show a few highlights. Basically, modern neuroscience has started with Golgi and this picture here. What he invented is a staining method. Before his time, when you slice the brain and you put it under a microscope, you could only see some amorph thing, no structure. And his staining method had the beautiful property that it selectively stained only a few percentage of the neurons. So there's many more neurons than you can see here, but you can clearly identify there is a cell body, there is one. And he also saw this arborescent structure. These neurons, they have some sort of, he called it kind of input cable, and they connect to many others. And he could see this structure, and very quickly it became clear that this might be an information processing unit, like something like the atom of computation in the brain. Let's jump. So we have identified these neurons. Researchers were then interested in finding out how information is processed or communicated, and it became clear it was electrical signals. Actually, it was already clear by then. But in the 1940s, 50s, Hodgkin and Huxley did a lot of research on this thing here. That's a spike. If a neuron wants to communicate an information to other neurons, it sends out an electrical spike. It makes like tuck, and has a duration of a few milliseconds and an amplitude of roughly 100 millivolts. And maybe you can see it here. That's a fascinating technique back then. They were lucky enough to have worked with this animal there because it has a very long and thick neuron. So the neuron, the axon of the neuron, the output cable of the neuron, was thick enough such that they could stick in an electrode. It was, I think, pretty delicate work. They measured the electrical signals. They could replicate this, which was more or less known by their time, but they didn't stop here. They put it into differential equations, which are still valid, and it's just mind-blowing how they modeled this shape with their time's techniques and knowledge. And of course, the two guys received the Nobel Prize for this fascinating work. Absolutely, fascinating what they did. Now, research continued. You have single neurons, they send out spikes. How is information combined to more complex things than single spikes? Neurons combine information, and Hubel and Wiesel were studying visual information processing. They were studying it in cats. I will now show a video. It shows an animal experiment. If you suffer with cats in some sort of experiment, close your eyes for a while. Basically what they do is they show different light stimuli to the cat. The cat is fixed, the eye is there, and they stick electrodes in the back. Humans as well as cats, we have a visual processing unit in the back of our brain, the visual cortex. And they were measuring electrical signals there, and were looking whether or not neurons respond to particular stimuli. And I think it's a very nice video here.
The researchers actually listened in to individual nerve cells firing in the anesthetized cat as they presented it with different visual images.
When we started working, Torsten and I, in the late 50s, we set up our first experiments, and they didn't go well because at the beginning we couldn't make the cells fire at all. We'd shine lights all over the screen, and nothing seemed to work. And rather by accident, one day, we were shining small spots, either white spots or black spots, onto the screen, and we found that the black dot seemed to be working in a way that at first we couldn't understand until we found that it was the process of slipping the piece of glass into the projector, which swept a line, a very faint, precise, narrow line across the retina. And every time we did that, we'd get a response.
Rather by accident, I like this sentence. And you might see it here, the very thin line. So they were thinking neurons respond to this kind of stimuli, some strong visual input. No, it was the very thin line there. And not only that, it also matters if you turn a little bit this thin line, there's no reaction. Another neuron will reply to lines by this orientation. Another neuron is tuned to these lines, and etc. And these receptive fields have been studied since then a lot. And it was a brilliant work by these two, Hubel and Wiesel, and they too got a Nobel Prize for their work. And it's groundbreaking work, because now it became clear, okay, it takes many retinal neurons, receivers. The information of many retinal neurons needs to be combined in order to detect a line. You cannot detect a line if you have just light or no line. You need neighborhood information to detect lines. So it became clear neurons combine this information very, very, very specifically. And this has been studied further. Today we have this understanding. There's this Beck visual cortex, V1, and it goes from simple to complex. That's very cartoonish, but more or less that's how many people think of it. We have line detectors, you combine two shapes, you combine two objects, you combine two faces, and there's a famous face, maybe have you heard of the Jennifer Aniston neuron detected in 2005. So, of course, this is not shaped by evolution, but learned in our brain, in hippocampus. Kurioka in 2005 has recorded single neurons in hippocampus and shown picture. And of course, he has selected famous pictures or pictures which he thought the patients have seen before, like Eiffel Tower or Jennifer Aniston, Spider, Julia Roberts. And the neuron is very selective. Bzz, so the da-da-da-da you have heard. Da-da-da-da-da. And it's invariant. So it's Jennifer Aniston, another version of Jennifer Aniston, extremely precisely and of course learned. And this is the next step then. How do we learn in the brain? And that's a whole research area. I just cite the one little sentence that's basically at the beginning of or triggered the way how we think about neural learning. It's we learn by shaping connection. We have neuron 1, neuron 2, they do da-da-da here, da-da-da-da there. If two neurons fire together, bum, 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 synchronously, they are likely to form a connection, or they have already a connection, but the connection will strengthen. Synchronous firing is strengthening connections. And fire together, wire together, that's a little bit the very simplified slogan of neural plasticity. Of course, it's much more complicated. By just synchronous firing, you will not detect pattern. It takes a little bit more, a lot more. But learning in our brain basically means connecting neurons via strengthening of synapses. Good. That was a short tour about neuroscience highlights. Let me now do a short tour about machine learning. And how do you recognize it's a machine learning paper? It's the ugly colors typically used in publications. And this is probably something you have seen previously. Machine learning is able to find bounding boxes, is able to categorize cats as cats and dogs as dogs. Great. That was a breakthrough a few years ago. It's now almost boring looking at such pictures. Things evolve extremely quickly, but it's still basically that's what computers, among other things, are good at. And this is another picture you might have seen. Deep convolutional networks have a longer tradition. One famous name, Jan LeCun in the 90s, who has thought about this kind of architecture. Back then, he didn't have the data nor the computing power to actually apply it, but the ideas have been around. And what you see is this architecture, and in the end, you get a vector of probability distributions. I'm not going to go deeply into this. Just one little thing. I guess you have come across convolution more or less and what it is, but this is the picture. So you have an input picture, you take a little patch, you have a filter, and you apply the filter on your picture, and you multiply each pixel, with the filter, and you sum up. So basically convolution is multiplication and addition. And keep that in mind for later. Okay. Why is it deep learning? Because we can have many of these layers, and it goes, and there's one of these links between neuroscience and machine learning. The picture it goes from simple features. You might have line detectors here, and you have like Jennifer Aniston neurons there. So this increased complexity, this clear correspondence between the two approaches, the engineering approach and what we see in the brain. It's far from It's far from completely understood how the brain works, and it's a very simplified picture, but this is currently one paradigm that has clearly a relationship between machine learning and neuroscience, or vision processing in the brain, maybe I should say. Okay, but what is learned when a machine is learning? It's not synapses that are learned in this. Well, you can think of it as synapses. It is the parameters of the convolution kernel. Beforehand, I was using this 3x3 kernel, and I just put in weights. And you can think of these 9 values, I just gave them to you, but actually what is the algorithms are doing is they learn these filters. They have to learn these values, in this case 9, but of course needs many, many, many more. You have many filters for different lines, etc. And now it's a relatively old model, but a breakthrough in image classification was 2013. AlexNet, 8 layers, 650,000 neurons, 62 million parameters. And we now reach multi-million or even billion parameter models. These numbers just keep growing. There have been conceptual advances, of course, but some of the best results in terms of accuracy are increasing these numbers. And the more data you have, the more complex your model is, the better the results are. That's currently what's going on many fronts. So how is it learned? So what is learned is these weights. How? From many pictures. So I give you a folder with cat pictures, I give you a folder with dog pictures, and your computer algorithm is learning by applying an algorithm, namely backpropagation, which is a combination of chain rule and dynamic programming. I'm not going to go into this, but it's kind of the keywords you have come across probably during your computer science studies here. So it's a famous algorithm that helps learning these 62 million parameters. You have 62 million wheels to tune your machine, and this is the algorithm to solve that problem. So there's a huge data hunger, which is definitely different from humans. I want to figure out a little bit how it is different. We need many free parameters. That requires many free examples. And not only this, it's not enough to have another 100,000 dog pictures. It's also about having the good pictures. And I want to do do we have time? Oh, a little bit. Very quickly go over an example of what it means to have good examples. Think of a self-driving car, and you just have to decide stop or continue. Stop or not, yes or no. So if you detect a picture like this, should you stop your car? Yes, I think so. If you're here, stop, yes or no? Not really, but maybe you slow down. If you see this picture, well, on the one hand, you can say it's actually leaving the route, and that's the street, and you could continue, but as humans, we probably look at the left, see whether there is another one coming. So, a bit of a tricky example here. And let's study this in terms of probabilities. A rare event like this might happen, let's just say, every 10,000 kilometers. Now you collect data for your machine learning algorithm, and you drive with your car, cameras on, and you drive 10,000 kilometers. So we are here. That's kilometers. After 10,000 kilometers of training data, which is kind of a lot, the question is, do we have such an example if it happens only every 10,000 kilometers? Now, of course, that depends on the statistical model. Let's keep things simple, some rare event. Maybe you think of an exponential distribution. Well, in some models, you get a value like 63% probability to have actually seen such an event. Could happen, could not happen. If you go to 20,000 kilometers, you get more and more. And you need more and more kilometers of training data to actually have seen such a rare event. You never reach 100%. And there's a very practical question. If I tell you, well, I have done 20,000 kilometers of training data, would you enter that car and say, okay, I'm confident, I'm reading a book, it's a self-driving car? Probably not. 80? No. 90? 95? 6? 99? Maybe. I'm not even sure. And look, the curve explodes because of the kind of data we need in order to get a reliability we actually want for practical reason. And just as a side note, first, there was a postdoc who did a test in Sion, 1.5 kilometer long, 6 kilometers per hour. I don't know, they're probably somewhere there. Google and Tesla, they have they have cars all around the world. They have probably all data. Go on Google Street View. There's every route, every street on the world is there. So there's something about the gameplays here. And as a little detour, we will see platform effects and winner-take-all economies there. As long as this algorithm works the way they do, and as long as we need data like that, it is. This is very different from humans. If I, as a human, see this, well, my brain is just one. It's all my neurotransmitters like dopamine and noradrenaline are my brain is flooded basically by neurotransmitters, and I will never ever forget this picture. And I could also generalize it if it's a little bit of a different animal or a car or a kid or whatever. I don't even need a precise example. If someone tells me, hey, this can happen, I can generalize. And that's fundamentally different from how a computer currently learns. So time-wise, yeah, I will skip a little bit. There is a link between how the brain does it, and it basically, events like this and these neurotransmitters, they can boost learning. They form synaptic connections much stronger in the presence of neurotransmitters. I'm skipping that. Talking a little bit about reinforcement learning just means there's a mathematical formalization, an algorithm of how you learn from experience. And you have maybe heard of the famous helicopter doing this kind of, artistic flying, learned by reinforcement learning, or Lee Sedol has been beaten in the Go game a couple of years ago, or you might have seen the famous Atari games, which are now superhuman computer. So reinforcement learning is a success story, but it takes this huge, it has this huge data hunger. Do we see reinforcement learning in the brain? Yes, we do. And funnily, in 1997, Schulz and others have recorded neurons in the brain, and they have seen these kind of firing patterns when there was a reward or no reward, and they have seen, there is the monkey gets a reward, neurons are firing, and the monkey sees a reward that predicts a reward, sees a stimulus that predicts a reward, and the neuron, after learning, start firing. And if there is no reward, although the animal expects one, there's a dip in this baseline. So they have looked at this data, they compared it with the reinforcement learning algorithm, and this has given rise to the reward prediction hypothesis of dopamine. So we clearly see an extremely striking correspondence between the theoretical reinforcement learning algorithm signals and neuroscience. So there is clearly the reinforcement learning theory has provided the tools to make sense of these data. Now, 25 years later, we know it's not the complete picture. The brain is usually much more complicated than a single simple algorithm, but clearly the relationship is there. I skip this part. Okay, now I've talked about machine learning, I've talked about neuroscience, and I want to compare a little bit the two. And for doing this, we need to ask what is intelligence and how can we compare such different entities like a brain and a computer. And I got this. So for the first question, what is intelligence? I got this definition from the Encyclopedia Britannica. Human intelligence is mental quality that consists of the abilities to learn from experience, adapt to new situations, understand and handle abstract concepts, and use knowledge to manipulate one's environment. Other definitions when it comes to machine learning is things like a Turing test, or Facebook has not a similar test, but has these question answering role games. It's more like operational definitions. If a computer is able to solve a certain task, we should consider it as intelligent. So now let's use this idea of intelligence and try to compare it in this framework proposed by David Mao in 1976, where he said, okay, if we study something or a complex system, we should potentially look at three levels. The computational, what is computed and why? The algorithmic, how is it computed? And the implementation level. And if we look at this, we see that AI can learn optimal moves if our task is to learn a game. We have 10 minutes? Sorry, I skipped this game. Sorry, I take this one. Let's take the example of image categorization, cats versus dogs. Second example. Now, the AI quickly categorizes images, faster than we can do it. At the algorithm level, we know it uses deep convolutional networks, backpropagations, it needs many examples, and at the implementation level, we have a CPU, GPU. Now, we humans do it differently. Well, we can do this. We do it often without even being aware, but as humans, we would also have a problem with 10,000 pictures of cats and dogs and saying, hey, what are you asking for? So we're kind of very different at this level already. At the algorithmic level, I've shown you this Jennifer Aniston neuron. We have a certain understanding about top-down, bottom-up processing, but we definitely do much better generalization. And at the implementation level, we are mostly clueless. We have ideas about neurons, we have seen these V1 neurons, but there is still many open questions. So to say how similar are the two entities, we can say, okay, somehow yes, at the level of computation, they're similar, but definitely when it comes to the implementation level, we have they're just too different. So we can say at this level, the AI passes an IQ test. That's fine. At that level, of the implementation level, we have a qualitative difference which is still not understood. So if we just look at this, we can say, okay, it's an intelligent machine, that's fair, for certain tasks it's great, but I would call it rather a sort of mimicry intelligence. It's not the kind of intelligence I would love to understand in the human brain, or what I'm looking for when studying the human brain. We can solve tasks, we can solve difficult tasks, but we have a problem at this level. I've shown you this, how computers solve these tasks. If you look into the computer, we see that, and that's the reason why computer scientists are happy when they can put a difficult problem into something as simple as multiplication and addition. They're happy because of this, because our computers are good at this. I've done the effort to look up the machine code for an add operation. That's what they are fast. But the problem is that's not even half of the truth. It's about the fourth of the truth, because computers mostly do moves. That's what they usually do if you look into the computer. And the reason is this one here. You all might know the von Neumann architecture, where we have a separation of memory and the CPU, well, the arithmetic unit. We do memory here, we do computation there, and we need to move data around. And the von Neumann architecture has this famous von Neumann bottleneck. And now compare this with this one. I don't have a memory unit here and move data into my computing unit. No, we have an extremely complex network of an extremely complex dynamical system, actually, which solves this task potentially very, very differently. So the question, can we understand the brain if we think of computers? Well, in a certain way, yes, but also the paradigm is certainly, we should definitely not think of a von Neumann architecture. That's definitely wrong. And there are, at the engineering level, at the implementation level, there's many differences. So we have these limitations by our current paradigms. And to end with, I don't have, unfortunately, the next paradigm. I just have this picture, which I like very much. It's a video. If you put neurons on a Petri dish, they start growing and connecting. And Daniel Dennett, famous neuroscientist and philosopher, he put it that way. The brain is a machine with a trillion moving... Almost on time. Okay. The brain is a machine with a trillion moving parts. Neurons are eukaryotes, autonomous agents, each with its own agenda. And I like to have this picture in mind when I think about human intelligence, much more than thinking about a computer or a von Neumann machine or whatever. So this is my last slide. I'm happy to take now your question. I hope you enjoyed it.
I have one. I'm not sure if it's fitting, but I heard about an experiment where they combined actually electronics and brain tissue, where they like put some electrodes in a petri dish, put in some liquid, and then they put brain cells in it to grow them, and put some current on it, and then connected this to a computer. And I heard it worked. Kind of some similar scenario where they could actually get an input and an output, and the brain cells were working. Did you ever hear of that?
No. I'm not aware of an experiment where they actually combined like the computing power of neurons with computing power of a machine. No, what's definitely done is, on the one hand, neuromorphic computing. We try to implement artificial neurons not only at the software level, but actually at the hardware level. There's a lot of research going on there. And on the other hand, you put neurons on a petri dish and you put electronics on it just to measure and receive the signal and try to get a better understanding of how these connections then lead to some emergent computational behavior. But of a chimera, I'm not aware of. Yeah, please.
Yeah, you mentioned the neuromorphic computing. And the idea, I believe, to use memory registers or something to simulate kind of this brain structure. Do you have any idea how far this research is and how close it is to something to that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of research. So the question is about neuromorphic computing and the state of research there. I think there's a lot of research going on the one hand, at companies like IBM in Zurich, or Rüschlikon, I think they do neuromorphic computing as a fundamental research. And within the Human Brain Project, there is, I think it's called Spinnaker, where the Human Brain Project tries to study the brain, but at the same time, about half of the resources are allocated to study implementations of brain architectures. And the Spinnaker tries to put the idea of neurons into hardware. The point is, if we don't understand the computing paradigm, if we just copy what we know and put it into hardware, we still have the same problem to solve. So I'm very skeptical, but at the same time, it's important to try and try different routes.
I would like to thank you very much for your interesting talk.
Thank you.
VIScon mug and something for the sweet tooth.
Perfect. So. that's a reward prediction error if you paid attention to. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Another warm round of applause.
Have a good year.